welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about criticism and classical music. Today on the show, I am joined by New York Magazine's architecture and classical music critic, Justin Davidson. Interested in being a composer, Justin originally studied music at Harvard and went on to earn a doctorate degree at Columbia. He began his journalism career as a staff writer at Newsday, where he wrote about music and amongst other things, and shortly after September 11th began writing about architecture. And then in 2007, he joined New York as their architecture critic, and he's the author of the book Magnetic City. For graphic designers, however, Justin might be most known for being the one to break the story of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, their then new logo back at the end of 2015, with a story that went viral calling the new mark a typographic train wreck. We begin this conversation talking about that piece and talking about seeing that logo and writing that story and kind of everything that came after that, before moving into what turned out to be a really deep discussion about the nature of criticism, the role of the critic, and how he approaches writing about both architecture and music. This conversation is just packed with insight on writing criticism and how to think about being a critic. Justin so clearly thinks really deeply about this work, and I felt like we could have easily kept talking about these things for another hour or so. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported by these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help with its ongoing production, I hope that you consider joining. Just go to scratchingthesurface.fm/members to sign up. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Justin Davidson.
I really don't write about graphic design very much.
Yeah.
Hardly ever. But I had one sort of graphic design triumph story.
Okay.
Which was the Met logo.
Oh, right.
That was like one story where it was a complete accident, and it just worked out in this weird way, and it had some ripple effects. But
Because you were the one that kind of broke that story, right?
I did. It just turned. The timing that was actually Ariella's catch.
That happened when I was in grad school thinking about graphic design criticism and how do we talk about graphic design. And so it was actually like a part of it went into my research because there was this big uproar around it.
Completely. Like, I had no idea that was going to happen. It was like the least calculated thing. I have to hand it to my editor, who put a good headline on that story.
Yeah.
And kind of really turned it into a social media thing through that. But it was like a end of the day last minute thing.
Did you have any idea that was going to turn into what it ended up turning into?
No. So what happened was my wife, Ariella, is the New York-based art critic for the Financial Times.
Okay.
So, we're kind of in the same general business, and we both work at home, so this is kind of like our, joint office. And so she got a mailer from the Met, which was, I think, 4 members or something. It wasn't a press thing. It was never announced. But she looked at the envelope, and she saw this new logo on it.
Yeah.
And, she's been living with the old, Vitruvian Man logo for, years. So, going back to her childhood, and the button you put on. So, they had gradually changed the button to the sticker. And she's very sensitive to that kind of thing. So she saw this logo, and she just handed me the envelope and said, "Is this the Met's new logo?" It was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, when she did that.
Yeah.
She had just picked up the mail, and she hands it to me. I was like, "Well, I don't know. I didn't hear anything about a new logo. Not that I would have necessarily, but I knew that they were opening Met Breuer, which was the story I was following." So she looked at it, and we both looked at it and said, "This is horrible. Like, this is what they came up with. This is terrible." And so I called the Met's press office, and I said, "We got this mailer. I'm just curious. Is this a new logo, or is this just like for this one mailer or something?" And the person in the press
Did
office...
you say who you were?
Yeah, they all said.
Okay.
I knew them, and I just said, "I'm just curious. I just got this on this mailer, and I haven't seen this before. Is this the Mets' new logo?" I had seen it. I had just been... In fact, I think we had been together at the Met Breuer. So I had seen a logo on the Met Breuer, which I thought was just for Met Breuer.
Right.
That's right. So when I called and I said, "Is this a new logo? Or is that just... I thought it was just for Met Breuer." The person whom I was speaking to in the press office said, "I can't answer that question, or I have to find somebody who can address that." Which, like, it was a yes or no question, and it was a public mailer. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, there's a story here. And so then I started quickly researching where this thing came from. And I noticed that the firm that did it had done the Tate, and the then director, Thomas Campbell, had come from the UK, and the director of Met Breuer had come from Tate Modern. And so I saw this whole London-based connection, and I looked at some of the other work that they had done. And then sort of like followed it up a little bit, all in the space of an hour, like just quickly trying to pull together some research. And I thought would make a cute little story, like, oh, here's this logo. Yeah. And so I sort of typed it up quickly, and then I guess they called me back, and I did an interview, and somehow in the space of an hour and a half, it turned from like a 200-word little item into a somewhat more in-depth story that I just pulled together out of interest. And I fired it off, and my editor put a good headline on it. I mentioned in the course of my story that the way the letters were, the way it was "the" on the top and "met" on the bottom, so that the word "the" is given as much graphic importance as "met," which struck me as a complete amateur in this area as preposterous. And then the spacing of the letters was such that they all kind of looked smushed together as if like they were on a bus that had stopped short. So he called it a typographical bus crash. And
that's right, I remember that.
That sparked like that. That went out. And what I didn't realize was that this was, or I guess I had an intuition, in part because of my wife's knowledge of the Met and who the people were. It started to become clear that this was part of a whole rebranding campaign that involved changing the direction, curatorial directions, integrating Met Breuer into the museum as a whole. So it was now 3 campuses, the Cloisters, Met Breuer, and Met Fifth Avenue, and that this was kind of a whole rebranding thing, which clearly started to seem like a multi-million-dollar project. And so this was the only inkling I had.
And I think, wasn't the image with your story like a photograph of that envelope?
That was literally an iPhone.
Yeah, I remember that.
That was an iPhone picture of the envelope that we got. And we put that up along with the old Vitruvian Man one. And so it quickly became clear that I had touched a nerve, because basically what that did was expose a sensitive point in a whole kind of administrative kerfuffle inside the Met, and a lot of curators who were feeling pressure from the director. It then subsequently turned out some of that had to do with, various kinds of improprieties, the way he was spending money, the whole sort of plan to extend, to renovate the, to create a new wing for modern art on the Central Park side, which was a David Chipperfield project. So it ballooned into this whole thing. But what I was told was that when that story came out, a cheer went up in the curatorial department, and that it like, everybody saw it and they're like, somebody is saying this.
Did you? So I remember reading that from the perspective of being a graphic designer, following, being a part of kind of graphic design Twitter, and that story just went viral amongst graphic designers.
Yeah.
Had anything like that happened to you before? Does this happen?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. I had no connection with the graphic design world at all.
Yeah.
So no. I mean,
Do you even, has your, you're talking about it, and I promise this whole conversation won't be
Yeah.
talking about your one viral graphic design story. But I think you're onto something when you kind of say that this was one piece of this larger kind of both issues and rebrand and repositioning of the Met. And I will admit that when I first saw it, I had the same reaction as you. And now when I go to the Met, I'm like, it's not that bad. Has your opinion changed at all?
You get used to everything. I think that what it opened up for me, what I saw in it was a whole sort of if it ain't broke, don't fix it situation where I thought that, there was something deeply satisfying about the old logo, but not because of the design of the logo, but because it represented something about the patrimony, the idea of the Met as a custodian of history into the past, and it sort of represented something ideal about humanity. There was all of the kind of tradition and idealism that the Met represents was embodied in that in a way that was not conscious to me, that I was not conscious of until I saw it disappear. It was just familiar. And so, it was like my bullshit antenna just went into the red zone because I just saw like, okay, what is this rebranding telling me?
Right.
And I was interested in the stuff behind that rebranding.
Yeah.
And rebranding generally means reorganization, and it means a direction, so that it has some intellectual content. And I felt like this was a logo that was sort of screaming that there was very thin intellectual content behind this huge, expensive, administrative push that seemed to be as much about, the assertion of superficial things onto a very deep and complex cultural institution.
I think this is actually like an interesting way. I was very curious to talk about your kind of, I hesitate to use the word process because I feel like it's like, I don't mean to like kind of belittle the work or make it sound too regimented, but I'm interested in how you think about your writing and the role of your writing. And so I think, the Met is actually like a great example of kind of this logo, maybe visually bad on its own, but it's also emblematic of these larger issues. And that is actually something that I like about all of your writing, is that you can kind of take these built objects and kind of pull out these larger stories. I loved your piece on Hudson Yards. I think, did that also, where you actually talked about that. I was kind of surprised how little you actually talked about the visuals themselves and more about what does this actually mean in New York? Is that something that's important to you? How do you kind of think about that when you go in to talk about a building?
Well, thank you for all of that. I think I'm most interested in trying to kind of get under the hood of whatever it is I'm looking at, and trying to understand what it means. And sometimes there's a kind of surface pleasure to things that don't mean very much. When I was predominantly or exclusively writing about music, I had the same approach. In music, the stakes are somewhat lower for any individual thing because you can try things, and if they don't work, fine, you move on. In architecture, you're talking about things that don't go away, that cost huge amounts of money and involve hundreds or thousands of people's labor and years to construct, and especially in a dense city, always have a kind of ripple effect. They always have a kind of presence in the city, in the environment, they are dropping an anvil into a bathtub. I mean, it's not just the shape of the anvil, right? It's what happens when you drop it in. So yeah, and I think that I would say that sort of started out in my consciousness through the way I got involved and interested in architecture as a kid. Because when I was in high school, and living in Rome, it wasn't just, it's impossible in Rome to isolate one building. I mean, there are a few that are kind of these monuments you can walk around, the Colosseum. They tend to be antiquity. But for the most part, buildings are, wedged in, they're layered, they cross many eras, they're bits of one period that get smashed into, a new design. There are older buildings that get a new facade. There are buildings that reorient themselves towards the street, or streets that reorient themselves towards the buildings. Rome has this incredibly dense, encrusted layering of interventions over time. And so asking the simplest question in Rome, why is that there? Which is sometimes an obvious question, because you see something so anomalous. All you got to do is notice it. You see like a piece of an old, of ancient Rome, like some column piece or a column base stuck into the side of the building. If you're noticing it all, you say, well, what the hell is that doing?
Right.
The answers to those questions are always extremely complex, and I had the good fortune of having a teacher who had some of those answers, or who pointed me in the direction of trying to figure out what the answers were and kind of looking analytically that way. And some of it just came from biking around and getting lost. I would bike in circles for hours because I couldn't figure out how to go in a straight line, because in Rome it's almost impossible.
Right.
And so just learning the geography on foot or by bike, and realizing how the streets related and what my landmarks were. So it never came from the contemplation of a single object. It was always objects, architectural objects and buildings and those elements, as part of trying to decode the city.
Yeah.
And so many years later, when I started to look at it, to do that professionally, to look at it that way, after all of the musical experience I had, I sort of came back to it in the same way.
So can you talk about how you kind of go about doing that and how you see your position as a critic writing about these things, where there are people who are in the profession, people who are architects, people who understand or have strong opinions on this, versus just a New York Magazine reader who maybe doesn't think about architecture at all? How do you kind of present these questions in a way? Are you thinking about both of those groups, or how do you kind of think about who this is for?
I don't really distinguish. I think my readers are, by definition, people who read, and they are people who are probably going to be people who are interested in urban life, in all its multifariousness. So some of that is, are people who are interested in food, or in, drinking, or, all the different aspects of urban life. And so I see it as I'm telling you what all of that cultural stuff, how that sort of takes shape in literally concrete form, and why. I think that, what's a familiar experience to most New Yorkers, and really to most people who live in cities, because, it's now sort of broader than just being in New York. There's this very familiar experience of seeing something new in the urban fabric, whether it's a new store or a new building or a whole new part of town, or a new waterfront or whatever, and looking at it and having a reaction that may be positive or negative, but mystified. And the question, especially when the reaction is negative, is who let them build that?
Right.
And that is one of those obvious, dumb questions that turns out to be a profound one. And in fact, I teach a seminar at the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia, which is in fact called "Who Let Them Build That?" Because the answers to that question is always, if you actually try to answer it to the point where if you were at a dinner party and somebody asked you that and you answered it, you would be boring them to tears. But in an academic situation, you want to dig in. And what the answer to that question, usually has to do with history, social history, financing, zoning, politics, the personalities involved, the architects who were fired, the architects who took over, a lot of the projects that didn't happen, and also in any city, but especially in New York, what was there before? Because there's very little building on virgin land.
Right.
So you always have to ask the question, what is it replacing? And the minute you start taking all of that apart, you have a much more interesting answer to the question of why is it like that?
Yeah.
Which to me is a much more interesting question than is it good?
Right.
So I think I started off, like most people, thinking about a piece of architecture, in a somewhat isolated way. And my question was, is this a good piece of architecture? How do I determine that? How do I form an opinion about it beyond just an emotional reaction? That sort of evolved pretty quickly into, is it a good building for New York? Is it right here? Is it, what's its context? How does it fit in? How does it operate? And eventually I got to the question that kind of guides me every time I sit down to write, which is, why is it here?
Yeah.
How did it get to be that way?
And is that, regardless of what you're writing about, whether it is a new building or a new development or, even, a show, a piece of music, are you kind of, is the why question kind of the important question for you?
It is when I'm talking about the city. The answers to that will quickly tend in one direction more than in another. Sometimes, the answer to why is a series of kind of obvious things. That's rarely true, though. I'm most interested in projects where the answers are elusive.
Yeah.
Where trying to tease that apart actually gives you some insight into the way the city works, into your relationship to it, and therefore into your own life. And that, I think, is something that, whether you're a professional in architecture or design or urbanism, or a reader who is not, I think anybody can relate to those things. There are lots of questions I ask architects and people on construction sites that inform what I write, but don't necessarily, I had a fairly extensive conversation today with somebody about, how to get, bug holes out of precast concrete, what kind of vibration you have to do, in the factory. It's like, I'm unlikely to really get into that level of detail in a column because most people are, not interested except maybe in passing. But all of this to say that, not every project has the same level of complexity. And I think, that you were asking about like whether I have the same attitude about a show or about music. Not so much, because there I think, it's gone through a series of sort of phases, creative phases, and then what's presented to you is the thing, and you can kind of judge it or experience it on its own terms.
I'm going to ask kind of a similar question in a different way, and this might be purely semantic, but I'm interested in how you think about the intersection or overlap, or even maybe the modulation between kind of the role of the journalist and kind of, where you are kind of interviewing the makers and kind of, presenting their side of, or their kind of story around it, or the concrete, kind of informational, the critic, which is, sometimes your opinion, your reaction to something, but also could be your opinion of how this relates to the city, but then also like that kind of, activist role a little bit of saying like, this is not good for the city or this is good for the city. Are those in conflict, are those different things? Am I kind of like breaking this apart too much? Are all those the same thing? You know what I mean?
So I am grateful to be in a privileged position where I can have a reaction to something that may be superficial, it may be emotional, it may be, kind of not terribly well considered. And I then have the responsibility to integrate that into a subsequent series of steps, which are gathering information, doing my homework, sort of so I can form that opinion, not as a way to give meat to an opinion I've already formed, but as a way to refine it and sometimes to reverse it, so that what I wind up expressing at the end of that process is hopefully more nuanced, more considered, hopefully not watered down by that process, but just argumentative, building a case.
Yeah.
And I think part of that has to do with the publication I write for and the kind of messages I got early on from editors, which was the strongest piece of writing is has a kind of moral urgency and argues a case. They really wanted from me, and it was really great training. I think has sort of like I've internalized that, not just a reaction, but a kind of prosecutorial approach.
Yeah.
And by prosecutorial, I don't mean like deciding something is bad ahead of time and then convincing other people that it is, but rather taking a set of facts and assembling it into an argument. So the activist part of it boils down to letting readers know, whether explicitly or not, that architecture is part of public life. It is not optional, right?
Right.
The one huge difference to me psychologically about writing about architecture as opposed to, say, music is that, any other art form you can choose to engage with or not, right? There are people who love theater and people who never go to the theater. You don't have that option with architecture. Even Ted Kaczynski, he lived in architecture. In fact, I think he, designed and built his cabin, which is now in the Smithsonian. Architecture is not something you can really opt out of in a city, and how it's put together really matters to everybody, no matter how private the space it encloses is, because cities are so shared, and the ripple effects of doing any one thing are felt at a distance. That this matters, and so because it matters, and because everybody has an opinion and everybody has a reaction, everybody is capable of integrating that reaction into a kind of a set of, reasoned conclusions, and therefore a kind of idea of what can and should happen in the future. And that's the essence of there's a kind of democratic baseline about that, right? That means that, like, if you don't like what's happening, you can go to your community board, you can run for the community board, you can express your opinion, you can go to all of the public hearings, you can protest, you can write to your elected officials, and if you do like what's happening also, everybody has a potential role to play, and the more informed that role is, the better. That sort of all flows into what happened. We have this incredibly complex set of rules that governs what developers can do. Those rules are subject to change and massaging, and that's all part of the democratic society we live in. It's a very different kind of engagement from just deciding whether you're going to buy a ticket or not.
Right.
Or whether you're going to tell your friends to buy a ticket or not. Right. That's a binary thing. You go or you don't go.
Yeah.
You like it or you don't, or you recommend it or you don't. When you're dealing with architecture in a city, there's just so much more going on.
Yeah.
which makes it interesting to write about.
I have I could ask you 20 questions based on that. I have two that may or may not be related. I'm going to ask them to you together, and you can kind of pick them apart if you want. I think what you said about, you kind of having a snap judgment, you'll have an immediate opinion, and then, part of your job is to then kind of research that, interrogate that, and kind of go deeper on that. And then you also talked about the difference between writing about architecture and writing about music, and I was interested in those two subjects and if there's any overlap or intersection there. Are you going through the same process, whether it's a building or whether it is a piece of music or a show or a performance, or how do you kind of approach each of those differently?
At this point, no, because just the way I cover them is different. My coverage of music, which has become a somewhat smaller part of my life than it used to be, is much more passive and reactive. I go to something, I have a reaction. It's accelerated. Yes, I then sort of say, okay, well, why did I have that reaction? It's like if you come home from a concert, and if I come home from a concert and my wife says, how was it, and I say,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That's great. That's one word. I still have a lot more words to go.
Right.
So you have to kind of flesh that out. But I don't feel the need to drill down as much. It's and maybe it's because I spent a lot of years kind of doing that, and there's sort of there's background there, but I think just inherently the kinds of stories that I'm interested in telling about cities and about the things in them have a kind of inherent complexity that not all musical events have or need to have.
Yeah.
They are more abstract sometimes. They could have more directly emotional. But also I think that yes, opinions and reactions to architecture and bike lanes and all of that are subjective, but your reaction to music is really fundamentally subjective. Right? What it does to you on a physical, emotional, psychic level is very personal. You can recognize something as well done even if it doesn't speak to you at all. You can recognize something as a total piece of kitsch, but somehow it touches something in you when you react. And so you can write that. When you're talking about putting up a building, that has to perform a lot of functions. It has to meet budget. It has to serve the people who paid for it. It has to serve the general public in some way. It has to operate, at many different scales. The scale of the skyline and the scale of the sort of the things that you can touch. It has to it has to meet all these codes. There's so many things it has to do that one of the things that you are looking at is how it balances all of those stretches and tensions.
Right.
That is somewhat less subjective, So ultimately, whether I like a particular, aesthetic gesture is less important than how it does all those things. And there's a kind of meaning in those things. Those are not just technical requirements. How it breaks all of that stuff down, gets right down to the meaning of architecture and therefore the meaning of our priorities and how we live and what we choose to devote our resources to and who is important and whose needs we accommodate over others. And there's always trade-offs in architecture. So what are those trade-offs? What are you trading for and for whom? Those are interesting questions that have an element of subjectivity to them, but they're not just like I like it or I don't like it.
Right. Are there things from writing about architecture that have changed how you think about music or writing about music or vice versa? Are there things from writing about music playing music, writing music that have influenced how you write about architecture?
It's hard to say because it's all sort of swirls around the same box.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard for me to separate out which things have influenced what. But I would say a couple things. One is that my training in music was as a composer, which means taking nothing and making something that exists out of it, and it exists in the real world, it exists in sound, and it has a physical dimension. Writing is not like that. It exists, but it's words.
Right.
It's words on a page. It goes directly from, it's a sort of communicative language. It goes directly from one brain to another. Music actually has to produce sound waves and exist in space and in time. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's somewhat like architecture. And it is, there is something it does have something in common. Music has something in common with architecture in that it may start from a kind of intuitive feeling, right? There may be something that you can't put your finger on about what it is you're trying to say. You just hear something, you have an impulse, you have a movement that you want to make, you have a sound that you want to produce, a scream you want to utter. And then you get to put it all together in a way that can be transferred to other people to execute and produce something that exists for the public. I was recently talking to Frank Gehry about this, and he was talking about a feeling. I said, well, how do you safeguard that intuitive impulse, that artistic, emotional impulse at the beginning through a process that takes 10, 15 years, involves thousands of people, hundreds of millions of dollars, innumerable regulations, the realities of trying to pour concrete and what materials can do and what metals reflect the light in which ways. You got to keep to budget, all of those things. How do you wind up at the end of that with anything that even remotely resembles the impulse, the human impulse that you started out with? So that to me is on a very large scale the same thing that happens when you sit down to write, especially, say, a complex orchestral work. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that you even bring up Gehry, because when you were talking about kind of your reactions to music, I think a lot about that video of Philip Johnson crying when he encounters Bill Bow for the first time, and that kind of emotional kind of response that, to me, and have not cried that much, but I've definitely been in buildings that have, moved me emotionally, just like a piece of music. And so I think there's something about, I think that's interesting that you kind of were talking to Frank Gehry about the idea. What
kept kind of pushing him about that, and he had a lot of answers. Some of it having to do with the technology they created, sort of 3D modeling that they do, but it's all in the service of trying to hold on to that, right? And often pushing against circumstance, against developers, against all of the needs, and sort of just being very clear in your mind where your leeway is. It's not. He did say, and this really struck me, that it's not a matter of compromising. It's a matter of understanding, when you're dealing with a certain level of complexity, where you can tuck and nip, still get what you want, and make it stronger, make it more, make the effect doable, and therefore, protect its effect at the end. And it's something that I recognize both from writing music, which is sure, you can ask a clarinet player to play a pianissimo high F out of silence because you like the sound in your imagination of that sort of thing, that whistle coming out of nothing and getting really loud. But actually what you're going to get most of the time is a really horrible squawk. So maybe you want to rethink that, because that's really, really hard to do, and it's not going to be reliable. Maybe you want to achieve that same effect in a different way. So That would be, one analogy. But the other is just in writing words. There are people who say, I thought about how to do this sentence. This is the way I want it. And to an editor who may react, negatively to that, like tough. It's this or nothing. Like, leave my prose alone. I'm not like that. I'm much more like, okay, you don't like that word. I'm not really sure why. I don't really get it because it seems fine to me. But you know what? English is a really rich language. If you don't like that one, I got 10 more where that came from. Right. No skin off my back to come up with another word. Or to rewrite the sentence 3, 4, 5 different ways. I'm still going to get what I want because I know what I want. And how I get there matters less than saying what I want to say.
Did that come? I want to kind of go back in time a little bit and talk about your background and perhaps how that kind of influences everything that we've been talking about. You studied music and you mentioned you wanted to be a composer, and you mentioned something I thought was interesting is that when you're writing about music that it's different because of that background. I don't mean to kind of like go into your teenage or early adulthood mind, but what did you want to do? What was it about composing and writing music that interested you?
Oh, I was just, so immersed. Just besotted with the whole idea of the musical life. The word musician had such incredible glamour for me, and there are so many different ways of being a musician, but just being able to create something out of nothing, and I was never. I studied classical guitar for a long time, but my motivating passion, certainly by the time I was sort of in high school and into college, was not really interpretive. It was creative, and so just I wanted to be creative. I wanted that experience of sort of having something come out of my brain and become a reality. So I studied that intensively, and I also just, studied other people's music as you do, and, got a tremendous amount of pleasure and, richness in my life because of that. There came a point where I had structured my life so that, as you can when you're a student, so that there are external expectations of you. Mm-hmm. For activities that the rest of the world does not care about. That's important because you need to you're at that point in your life where you are motivated by fulfilling other people's expectations. Mm-hmm. I discovered that was something that really mattered to me. Yeah. And when that scaffolding fell away, it's a traumatic thing, or it can be liberating, but it can also be this moment where you're like, okay, now, literally there is not another soul in the world that cares what I do next. Mm-hmm. So it all has to come from me, and I have to create that need. I have to get other people to experience the same need that I have for my music. That was a kind of bit of a slow motion existential crisis for me, because while I had acquired a fair amount of technique and knowledge and history and practical experience, what I found was that I was not. First of all, I didn't have that kind of internal compulsion where I had to write music because that was the only way I really knew how to be a fully fledged human being, which I think is, if not a prerequisite, it's a strong motivator. I was not like that. And I guess when I really got down to it, it was I know a lot about how to say certain things in music. I'm not sure I really have this deep conviction of what I want to say. And I had been to so many concerts where I had that same feeling about many other composers, where it was very professional. They were very clear about how they went about getting certain effects, but there was a kind of something missing for me, and that some fundamental vagueness about what it was that was this impulse that started the whole thing going. And I thought, I don't want to have that reaction to my own music, and I certainly don't want other people to have that reaction. And I struggled against it. Now, I think it's possible, and maybe this is another conversation, but I think it's possible that had the timing been different, had the era been different, had there been other kinds of opportunities that I pursued, maybe I would have gotten over that hump. Maybe I would have kind of like muscled past that. And in the end, basically, well, not in the end, but at that point in my life, I sort of moved in a different direction. It wasn't a big jump for me to feel like I was writing words instead of music. It didn't feel like a completely different thing. It's still basically the same. And
so how did you realize, or was there a moment, or what was that like when you realized, I don't have to write music, but I could still be in this world that I still love, I think, by writing about music?
That was not an existential decision. None of it. I mean, again, in retrospect, it all sounds more portentous.
No, I know.
Sort of like self-defining than I ever experienced it. For me, it was just like, today, I'm maybe not going to write music. Maybe I'll go back to it tomorrow. And then maybe tomorrow I did, but then the day after I didn't. It was sort of like incremental that way. And writing about music was really the same. It was basically, I finished graduate school. I did realize that I was, graduate school is fundamentally a PhD program is fundamentally a preparation for an academic life, for teaching, and I decided that involved a bunch of trade-offs I didn't want to make, predominantly leaving New York. So I was just kind of looking for opportunities simply to get paid to do anything in music, and maybe even not. And so that was just a matter of latching onto one thing and then another and then another. It was not at any point something I thought, this is really what I'm born to do, until I was doing it. And I think there've been a lot of things like that in my life that sort of when I'm doing them, all of a sudden it becomes a snowball, and then that's my life, and I'm very immersed and passionate about it. But it's not like I ever had this vision and then went after it.
And then was writing about architecture the same thing, where it's like, suddenly you were...
Yeah, I had the good fortune. So my first real job was writing for Newsday, which was a Long Island and at that time New York City-based publication, and I was writing a lot about music, going to a lot of concerts, and it was kind of a cool position to be in because they were willing to devote a fair amount of space and a full-time salary to classical music, but there really were not too many people, if any, at the paper who actually cared about it. It was sort of maybe the end of a moment where they felt like they should, because that's something that newspapers did, even though they weren't so convinced how important it was, or that was necessarily a good use of resources. But whatever, they had me, they used me, and I was doing it. But whenever I said, hey, you know what, there's not that much happening, say in the summer, I'd like to pursue some other projects, maybe do some other stuff, they were like, great, fine. So I would often take summers off, and I would do various other kinds of journalistic projects. Had nothing to do with music, and they were very varied. Some of them didn't have anything to do with the arts or culture or anything. They were just journalism, and they were sort of time-consuming reporting jobs, which I loved doing. And so when I started to say, it was really basically in the aftermath of 9/11 where architecture and rebuilding Lower Manhattan became such a news story, that I said, we're covering this in 10 different ways. We're covering the politics and, counterterrorism and the war, and all this stuff, but we're not really dealing with the architecture. And so I had started to do some architecture already, but at that point it became like, okay, you do it. you know, and it was just sort of stepping into a void for which I was questionably prepared, I guess.
Yeah.
But, you know, that has always been my life, which is kind of learn on the fly and get somebody to pay for my education and, you know, like, kind of just keep doing it intensively. And so I did. And again, you know, that was maybe an accident of timing as much as anything else. But I'd say, you know, maybe in retrospect, what holds all of this stuff together is, you know, what's really sort of there at the bottom for me is, you know, the desire to create, whether it's in music or in words, and the desire to grapple with complicated stuff and try to clarify them for myself and to try to get across an experience and a sort of deep and rich body of knowledge that one could experience totally superficially and on the fly. And my job has always been to kind of invite readers to experience it a little bit more deeply. So, you know, you can hear a piece of music and it either sounds nice and you walk out and you're like, yeah, that was pretty good. So my job is to say, hey, excuse me, before you go home, can we just talk about this for a minute? Like, what did you really feel? Like, how did you like this? Did you notice that? Do you know that this other thing? You know, and the same thing with architecture. It's just about trying to get readers to take another step.
I love that. And it brings up a question that I think can kind of lead into, I have just a couple questions to kind of wrap up. And I think thinking about your time at Newsday and, you know, having a salary and getting to write about classical music and then doing these other things is it's like a good example of how much kind of journalism and publishing and this whole world has kind of changed since then. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about kind of the changing state of the critic, and especially architecture criticism and even, you know, classical music criticism to an extent, that these types of positions are just fewer and fewer. Does that change how you think about the job that you're doing? Do you think about that? Where do you see this all headed? Okay.
I mean, look, you know, I feel, you know, very lucky. I kind of have always felt, really, from the time I began, because, you know, it's easy to think that the sort of crisis in criticism or in journalism or in media is a recent vintage. It's not. Yeah. It's just been changing constantly. But, you know, like, we kind of knew this was going on 25 years ago. And I'm sure people, you know, before me had the same sense too. But, you know, I kind of have always felt that I was standing on a really nice rock, and you know, the water was coming up all around me, and as long as I could hold on to that rock, I was fine. That's sort of a metaphor I came up with for my professional life a long time ago, and I never thought it was going to be quite so literal or global.
That's not funny, but it's kind of funny.
Know, so in a sense, we're all in that position.
Yeah.
Look, for me, having a salary and benefits and just kind of the mechanics of, you know, a regular job was everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, you know, I was a union member, and I am delighted to say I am again. You know, these things matter incredibly, and for me, it meant the ability to, you know, make decisions about what I was writing, how I was writing, more independently than if I had been a freelancer. And I have been a freelancer, so I know exactly what that means. You know, I have written plenty of pitches. I have been turned down for many, many things. I continue to freelance sometimes. You know, so I know exactly what it means to put a huge amount of time into trying to develop an idea, try to sell somebody on it, understand that it's not right for them, and maybe not now and maybe not ever, realize that all that time you put into it is for naught, and you're not going to get paid for it, or if you go ahead and do it, you're going to feel underpaid by the time you finish. No, that's all something I understand in my bones, and I literally think about every time, you know, my paycheck arrives. So that is a structure that I think is, of course, it's endangered, and I think that it's because employers, the kinds of people who rely on what we do, don't really understand what they're paying for.
Mm-hmm.
Partly, of course, it's a buyer's market. There are a lot more people who are willing to,
right.
to pay the price,
Mm-hmm.
to subsidize. Look, basically, what it comes down to is people who are starting out, or people who are freelancing and trying to do this and pursue their ideas in an idealistic way. They're effectively subsidizing these companies,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously that shouldn't happen. But the result is that the employers don't really get what they should have. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I know for myself that if I had not been lucky, I probably would have gone in a different direction because, as I said with language, I'll pick another word. I probably would have picked another life.
Yeah.
And I may yet,
Right.
it's like, who knows?
Right.
Yeah. So I think that is really tough. I'm always gratified to see when somebody does, get one of these jobs. I think, maybe a little bit here and there. They're starting to put together some slightly different models.
Yeah.
Maybe, I think, Mark Lamster's model
Yeah.
in Dallas,
Yeah.
where he's half between teaching and the newspaper, is kind of interesting. There are some nonprofit models, but, that's all sort of around the edges.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, to get somebody, let me just put it in the simplest way. Like, I will go and put in a day visiting a construction site or talking to an architect without being certain that I'm going to write about it.
Mm.
Because I might be interested. I might think maybe there's a column there, but whatever. It's like how I apportion the time that my employer pays for.
Right. Yeah.
So
that's
I'm still
interesting.
working. It may not wind up with a column, and I'll, text my editor and say I'm going out to this. I don't know if it's going to work out or not. Fine.
Mm-hmm.
If that's on me,
Yeah.
if that's my risk, if it means that I'm doing that instead of doing something I will get paid for, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be less well educated and less. Now, by all means, and I hope you don't edit this out. I don't want to leave the impression that freelancers are, therefore less well prepared or less.
Yeah.
I know that, the conscientious people who will do this against all the odds. They're going to put in that time and really sort of want to build themselves up. But in the end, what it means is that the writer is subsidizing work that the employer should be paying for.
My last question, I'm curious what you're thinking about now. What are the subjects that you either haven't written about that you want to write about? Are there things happening in the city that you're excited to be writing about? What's next?
Well, it's always changing. I have this weekly column, so I keep on trying to find the thing for this week, or try to plan a few weeks down the line. At the moment, I was at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden today. They're opening a new garden by Michael Van Valkenburg, a new sort of just ramp, basically switchback accessibility ramp, which could have been a very basic kind of design, but they got Weiss Manfredi to do it as an extension of their visitor center, so it's part of the visitor experience. So trying to figure out whether that makes a column. Mm-hmm. I'm distressed that the Soldiers and Sailors Monument on the Upper West Side is falling to bits, and trying to figure out whether I can translate that distress into a persuasive column. I mentioned I'm interviewing. I interviewed Frank Gehry, so I'm sort of editing that conversation. I'm always on the lookout for stuff that's happening in other cities that where those things inform each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I was at the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco. I guess it's now called the Salesforce Transit Center. To take a look at that, because just the idea of a huge transportation infrastructure project in the heart of the city and what that does to the city around it seems like that applies certainly to New York. We could do the new bus station also. But really every other city. So the issues that it brings up are both very specific and interesting, and also generalizable. I'm kind of interested in, I don't really know very much about it, but I'm kind of interested in seeing what the sort of Walton family sponsored design excellence program in Bentonville, Arkansas has yielded.
That's an interesting one.
I'm not really sure about that. So anyway, just those are a few of the things I'm working on right now.
Justin, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.
This episode was recorded on November 13th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.